Truly and faithfully, diligently and impartially, perform the duties of the position of planning commission for the city of Toledo, Lewis County, Washington, as such duties prescribed by law, duties prescribed by law, so help me God. So help me God. Congratulations. That's that one. And the one, this is just the copy for you to read. Right, that's what I read.
Like to have a seat to the right of Mr. Hill there. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, it's good to have you, Lucas.
First on the new business calendar is how to track and make changes to land use codes.
That agenda item came from me, primarily because of the public hearing that we just had.
Right.
Todd and I reviewed the requirements in the code, and we would need 8.5 or 4 feet of plywood in order to print.
Comply with it.
Exactly. But Todd also reminded me that, any changes to code has to go through SEPA, public hearings. And so what I'd like to have you guys discuss is, do we accumulate to a certain point and then do an update to the codes, as things roll in? I mean, this particular one can wait, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it can. Now the city is the one that issues a notice of no effect, essentially, right, on a SEPA. We fill the SEPA out and then we essentially.
So the SEPA process is part of your application process for projects of a certain size.
Right.
Because Mr. Reddick proposed a project that was below the SEPA threshold, we did not actually process SEPA on that application. The city's exempted multifamily developments up to 18 units, I think, which is the state maximum that you can elect to do that. So in this case, his project didn't require a SEPA notice, but because we made it a public hearing, it did require notices of the hearing for a land use action. And when we looked at the code, your code requires that the notice be posted on site in no less than 2-inch tall letters for each. So what we tried to do was we tried to pare down the words in the noticing, and with that, we were able to get the 2-inch lettering on a 4x8 sheet of plywood. But we didn't end up doing that because we didn't have any way to produce that in the short time that we had in order to get the noticing out. So, so I guess technically we weren't compliant with our own noticing requirements for that, although we did post the site and we did provide notice. It just wasn't compliant with our 2-inch lettering. So there's a number of different things that happen with land use applications. Usually a mailing goes out to the people who are adjacent to the site or within a certain distance. There's the SEPA process, which may be triggered, which requires us to notice the tribes and state and federal agencies and anybody else who's on the list that has requested to be notified for SEPA. And then there's the site posting, which we haven't done. I didn't realize that Toledo had one of those, and it wasn't until I researched it this time. So for the previous applications that we've done, there hasn't been something posted on the site, but.
Well, when we changed the grades of the sidewalks to reiterate not greater than 12% as opposed to requiring 12%, that was a SEPA notification as well, was it not?
So that wasn't a specific site land use application. So
Right.
the SEPA exemptions don't really apply there. Whenever you're changing your zoning code or whenever you're changing one of your environmental codes, generally, I mean, there are other things that may require SEPA too, but in that case, you're required to go through the SEPA process for any change. And that is true. I mean, last time we packaged up a couple of different changes together. This time there's just the one change that Cindy and I noted as part of that process. Like, wow, that's hard to comply with and impossible for the city to comply with on short notice. So, and it's the city's responsibility to post the site according to your code. So what we're bringing forward is a request to change your noticing requirement, but then Cindy's also asking the question of. There's expense, every time we change our code, we have to go through this much process. But if we can package 2 or 3.
And that's my question, how much of a process based on a code change that affects nothing site-wise, doesn't affect square footage of impervious, doesn't really have a SEPA effect, so to speak. It's just changing a notice within the land use, how much of a pain in the butt is that?
It's the same as any other change to your code. So, and that is true if you do one of them or if you rewrite your entire zoning code. It's the same noticing process.
Okay,
So whenever you alter your zoning code, you're changing the law. And whenever you change the law, you're affecting all the citizens in the city.
you're gonna have to notice all.
So you're gonna have to publish a public notice and hold a public hearing to satisfy that requirement. Then the state, whenever you change your zoning code, they require you to go through the SEPA process.
Right.
And as I said, if you do one small change, it requires the big process. If you were to rewrite the whole zoning code, it would require the same noticing process. You're changing the law, you'd still send out notice to all the same people you're. So there's an efficiency if you can bundle some of these together. And then also if you bundle some of these together, there's a way to look at how one may affect the other. In this case, the noticing isn't going to affect too much of the other sections of code. But you know, when we do the driveway code, does that then affect some other thing that you want to consider elsewhere in code? So it allows you to look at it more holistically if you were to say, well, every 6 months, we'll process a code update. And we'll do these as a batch. So then what staff would do is we'd accumulate all those for the 6-month period, and then twice a year, we'd do the noticing process. Or maybe you choose to do that once a year. Or
That's all very understandable. I guess my question is what happens when we get put in a similar position until such time as we make the code change? If we end up having to have a public hearing over something. And are we stuck with trying to
right now,
satisfy these or not comply?
right now, those are your choices, but land use hearings are usually more predictable than this last one. Usually we can see them coming, and in this case, had we known that this was going to go to a public hearing, we could have asked the shop to prepare the signage and got it posted and complied with code. It was just because this one happened so quickly and because I was unfamiliar with your codes. So I didn't know that was required. So basically, if you do decide to take something to a public hearing, instead of scheduling it for a couple of weeks out, you might want to schedule it for a month out at your next meeting. That'll give us time to get the signs printed and posted and up on the site in time.
Are our shops capable of doing that?
But are we really talking about making 4x8 sheets of plywood for public?
Well, it doesn't have to be plywood. Your
Well,
code now is a
yeah.
little bit strange in that it doesn't, most of the jurisdictions will say the size of the sign, not the size of the lettering.
Right.
So your code actually says they have to be 2-inch tall letters. So that means that if you have a lot to say in your public notice, as we did in the case for the street vacation and the things that Mr. Reddick did, then it may actually be more than what a 4x8 sheet would be. You can go to a print shop and they'll print banners and you can hang them on site on posts. There's nothing that says it has to be, but it has to be weatherproof, right? It has to hold up during the rain, especially in this environment. It can't be something that's
And
gonna,
most of their banners are.
yeah, most of the sign banners are, but we couldn't just print it out on a plotter. You know, a lot of places have plotters that are capable of printing large sheets of paper, but you couldn't meaningfully hang a sign on their paper.
But does anybody do that?
Yeah, in Clark County and many jurisdictions down there, they require a 4x8 sign for every land use application. No one that I've seen requires 2-inch tall letters. They let you pack as much content you want onto that 4x8 sign. Other jurisdictions, they'll require signs. I think the city of Kalama is it's 18 by 24 or something along those lines, so it's a larger size sign. The idea is that people that are driving by the site should take note that there's something happening there. So they are usually larger size signs. You're not alone in that, but you are alone, as far as I can tell, in requiring 2-inch tall letters for every word on the sign.
So is that something we'd rather change the 2-inch letters and dictate a sign?
Probably. I think the question that Cindy wanted us all to talk about tonight, though, was that's an example of a code change that needs to occur.
Mhm.
And we can come back with some staff recommendations when you're ready to consider that, but the discussion tonight is. You want us to consider these as they come up and bring them forward and go through the public notice process with each one. We as staff are fine with that, but there's an efficiency in packaging these together so that the city's not paying the cost of all the public noticing and my time and everything to do them all individually. So,
Well, it makes sense to bundle them like that then, and twice a year, like I think you mentioned twice a year. Go through them, unless we'd want to have, of course, the discretion, or the city would want to have the discretion to say, no, we can't wait 6 months. We need to do something, you know.
But I think that's a
Yeah.
council decision, not a planning commission decision, because it's an expense. It's the use of funds that we don't have the power to.
probably right, and I guess based on tonight's discussion, we can put together a staff report and take this issue up with council. And get some direction from them.
Yeah, it's about $100 to print it in the newspaper. I mean, that's really what the expense part and Todd said.
Well, and the cost of the 4x8 sign too.
Well, yes, unless.
Where would we put
unless-
that?
unless you guys want to make this tonight. Re-describing what a sign is for notices. And we could go through the SEPA process and get this particular item done, and then at least we'll be compliant moving forward.
Well, we could also be compliant, but that's what I was saying, is I think that typically the land use time. Normally hearings, you can see them coming months away. You know, with the subdivision that we did, we knew when that hearing was going to be, and we could have done the signage for that one. Had I read your code more carefully and known that there was a sign requirement. In the case of Mr. Redding, it was a little bit unusual in the fact that at one meeting, we decided, yes, we need to have this, and we wanted to do it sooner than later, so we had a special meeting. But so in that case, we didn't know the public hearing was coming, we didn't have time to engage a sign company or a banner shop or somebody to print that for us. And that was at the time when I also discovered that section in your code that said that you had to do it, so.
Is there a ballpark cost comparison of going through the SEPA process for this one item versus how many signs we'll need to and notices we'll have to give out over the next 6 months or so?
Well, to go through the SEPA process, in this case, because we're the applicant, I prepared a SEPA checklist. Those were about 4 hours. My billing rate is about $150 an hour. It is $150 an hour, no about. The sign printing, the publication costs are, Cindy said $100 to publish it in the paper. The cost of the sign is probably gonna be at least that. I mean, usually when you go to a banner shop and you get a 4x8 thing printed.
That's gonna be probably closer to $150 to $200.
Yeah,
Those
Or
are
the price of plywood, which would kill you anyway.
But if you're trying to compare the cost of going through a SEPA and public noticing versus the cost of doing one of those. It's probably to do the public noticing that's compliant with code is probably in the neighborhood of $400 or $500 by the time you consider staff time and other time
per instance.
per instance.
Yeah.
Whereas if we were to go through a code change, that would require me preparing a public notice for the hearing. That would require me to prepare a SEPA checklist and complete the SEPA process. You know, it's, like I said, it's probably 3 or 4 hours to prepare the SEPA checklist, and it's probably at least another couple of hours to prepare the public noticing and to assist with trying to get the noticing out. And then it's my time here to go to the hearing itself, which is another couple of hours. So, I mean, it's over $1,000 to process a code change. Whereas the thing that you're saving, if you changed your sign thing, would only be the $200 or $300 cost to print the big sign. You still have to go through the publication of the newspaper. You still have to take the staff time to do all those other things. So I don't think it's unless you have a slew of land use applications coming in the next 6 months, then the amount of money that you'd spend to change the code for this one item would be more than what you might spend on one or two applications and the public noticing requirements as they're printed.
Okay,
So was that a good?
That was
cost
very
comparison?
helpful. Thank you. Yes.
yes, sir.
Yeah.
The nice thing about doing it, and, you know, if you do it whether quarterly or every 6 months, is we can budget. That's the same thing to budget for, as
Yes.
opposed to one-offs.
Well, quarterly or
Whatever. it's-
Like grouping them quarterly.
biannual,
And then allow
Yeah.
for, as Tom said, exceptions if we've got some important that comes up.
right,
Mhm.
that makes more sense. Okay,
And that makes sense, but I'm sure there's gonna be some very like critical exceptions that we'll need to consider at some point.
so no, the state law does not have a requirement as far as what needs to be said as far as the height of sign size?
No, they have requirements about public noticing and posting of the site, but not specifics about size of lettering or size of signage.
So
Some jurisdictions will just do 11 by 17 postings. They can print that out and laminate it in-house. So some jurisdictions have done that. Other jurisdictions, like I said, like in Clark County, many of those jurisdictions do want the 4x8 sign be placed on site. And in Kalama, their public works goes out and does that because they have the tools to be able to get the signs on the site, the trucks and the tools, so. So Public Works does it, the planning department prints the sign and sends it to Public Works and they mount it on their pre-made signboard and they roll it out, post it. So,
Sounds like a nice expense, a lamination machine so that we can print them out rather than have somebody else print them.
well, if you were to change your code eventually, you could, like I said, you could do that on an 11 by 17 sign, if that's adequate in your community.
And mount that on a 4x4 post in the ground and Public Works could handle that without any problem.
Or they could put it
Or as T-post.
at 11 by 17, you could just use a wooden stake and pound it in and staple it to it.
So what I did for this particular one is made sure that that there were multiple laminated
Mhm.
items on multiple stakes in order to get enough of it visible.
Right,
So that I mean, I would hazard to guess is that if you needed more laminate, you know, more 11 by 17s for a particular instance, you could do that.
okay,
Well, I know for myself, if I'm driving along. And somebody's posted you know, an intention to do something that impacts the neighborhood. I don't read it as I'm driving. I mean, that would be dangerous.
Mhm.
And I think even if it was on a piece of plywood, if there was any amount of text, it's still dangerous to read it as you're driving. So you have to stop and get out and look.
yeah,
And you can look at an 11 by 17 as easily as you can. Well,
Some of us
I don't like the plywood idea. I really don't.
Or your code requirement is not for plywood.
Yeah.
It is for the size.
For the
of
2-inch
lettering.
2-inch
So how-
letters.
How do you
Yeah.
choose to display it? We're just comparing it to a 4x8 sheet of plywood because everybody knows what that looks like.
but I think that's a good point. I think I would tend to want to try to read an 8x4 sign as I was driving by. Being required to stop and read a posting on 11 by 17 would, number one, make other people a lot safer. And it makes you stop and read the whole thing. So that you're not just getting little bits and pieces as you drive by.
Well, and a lot has to do with the character of your community too. I mean, downtown here, speeds are slow, people are walking, you're more likely to notice it in the neighborhood at night. If it's just posted on the site at any size, you'd most likely be curious about, well, what's that thing over there stuck in the yard, and you go over and read it. So in your community, it may be fine to have a smaller size sign with smaller size lettering. But your code right now doesn't allow that, so that will be a change that we bring forward. Eventually, and it's just a matter of do we do it sooner or later? And then how do you want to handle these categorically? I mean, we can discuss them one by one, we can bring them up as part of your agenda and just talk about it. Is this one you want to do now, or you want to batch this one up with the rest of them? And you know, I guess unless council gives other direction, then that gives you the flexibility then to say, well, we've got enough of a batch now, let's do these. So as we talk about them from month to month. I know that I would recommend that as you continue to grow, that you seriously consider looking at your zoning code. Right now you have one non-residential zone and one residential zone. For the town as it's been, that's been fine. But we saw recently what that is when because you're allowed to do all densities and all zones within the city. And that, while that seems to have worked for this town in the past, I don't believe it's gonna work in the future when you start to consider the infill type of development that's going to occur, the number of those, I mean, right now you're only limited by height and what you can fit on the site for the number of units, and your community doesn't seem to want that
Well,
anymore.
that's very true, and they don't, and I could see some guy coming in here with big dollars. Buying an entire block and throwing up a 3-story, 25-unit apartment building right in the middle of town where people would just freak out.
And your zoning code allows it, so you'd have to permit it. As long as it met your development code standards, so I'd encourage you, and I'll do so as I get in front of council too, to think about a time when you have the cash reserves, because going through a code overhaul can take a lot of time and energy, and usually it's more than what volunteers can do by themselves but to have multiple residential zones, to think about where those go throughout the city, to think about separating commercial and industrial into 2 separate categories. And even to come up with a different variety of commercial uses, so you don't allow all sizes of commercial buildings to go in all commercial zones. You really want big blocks downtown Toledo or.
Well, I think that's been one of the problems we've had is that our commercial district allows for any commercial, and so we have valuable retail space along 505 that's being taken up by manufacturing. And probably shouldn't be. So when council and planning get together and start figuring out how we want to grow the city and along those lines, then I think there's gonna be some changes. Probably sooner than later. Do we want to set a schedule for how often we're going to look at code changes? Now, we managed to do we went through our land use code, didn't we? At the same time we did our growth management plan.
But we were making a ton of changes.
But we were making a ton of changes.
Well,
And what makes a ton of sense to have different zones.
and you actually never repealed the land use code that you have in your existing code when you adopted your new one. The ordinance that enacted your new zoning code didn't undo what was there before.
So is that another ordinance that needs to be passed by council with regards to repealing the old one?
It would be, but that too would take a public hearing, public notice. It could have been done at the same time.
Yeah.
Usually you repeal and replace, but you adopted new code. And so you still have fragments. Luckily, there wasn't a lot in there before, so there's not a lot of conflict. Because your previous code didn't say much about land development, about anything. So there's not a lot of conflict in there. And usually the way staff addresses that is we try to address both. What's in the development code and then what's in the old code. And we just try to recommend resolution to that. When we did the subdivision approval, there were some pieces of old code that were addressed in the staff report too, so.
And we did do that during staff report, and my question is, are we gonna get hurt by the remnants that are left behind from the old code?
Well, I
Is
think
that something that should go as on its merit, its face, a new ordinance that council repeals the old ordinances before we step into the arena of going over our land use codes once again?
yeah, I think as a recommendation, to council with the first batch of code updates that you do, that planning commission should recommend to council that they repeal the remnants of the old code out of the previous code of ordinances, and maybe even to recommend that they, instead of having a separate code book for development code, they incorporate this as a chapter of the city.
But we would be able to take care of that in the same public hearing session
Absolutely.
and same notification that.
So you could do the code change for the signs, any other code changes that you might want to do to clean things up. And you could repeal, replace, and amend all in the same all in the same public noticing action. It would just be noticed as a code update action.
Okay, I think planning commission is gonna look for some direction from council on when and how thoroughly we want to go through this land use code.
We're budgeting right now, so now's the time to, if we had an idea of what you think it would cost, that's time to put it on the budget for 24.
Well, okay, now budgeting, I'm free, he's free. He's free. and he's-
That's a
You're
council
not.
action. That's a council action. Well, I sort of am. Tonight I'm free, but and it's not true. I'm paid for out of the lump sum.
Okay, but, I mean, I was under the assumption that we would attempt to do this on our own. Are we thinking we need outside help for that? I don't consider him outside help.
No,
But
I,
I'm caught that by asking for a budget of what he thinks it would take.
Okay,
From his time.
yeah, we can talk more about that. I'm happy to provide those numbers.
okay. Very good. Any further on this? What do we want to do?
I think we need to get some input from council once they know what budget we have for it and when we can apply it. And then from there, then we can start considering it.
Well, I'm on board with the bundling idea. I like that. It makes sense.
Let's- Okay, I don't think that needs a motion. I think we're just all in agreement, so.
Yeah, and we're asking for direction. So just to discuss and summarize your discussion is fine. Seems like the direction I'm hearing is ask council.
Okay. Very good.
We're happy to go through it once we know we have the resources in place to do so.
If you'd like, I could just give a quick update on the.
I was gonna ask you if you would please give us an update on the growth management meeting that you attended today.
Thank you, Chair Birch. I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
While he prepares, it's easy. It's a hand grenade that you just throw into our entire process.
Well, I was gonna hit it for a higher level summary in that, basically today at the Plan Growth Committee meeting, we talked about a couple of different elements. We talked about, for your benefit, for the benefit of the commissioners, but especially for the new commissioner. So the city of Toledo is going through an update of their 20-year growth plan. They go through that together with all the other cities within Lewis County. Lewis County goes through it because they're required to by the state to do that every 7 years. So this process can happen as frequently as once a year because of the expense and the time involved. Most communities don't do it unless they have to. Because it's very, very expensive to get through it and it's time consuming. In this case, this is the 2025 comprehensive plan update for Lewis County. All the cities in Lewis County also will update their plan in 2025. We're starting the work now because of the significant amount of effort and coordination that goes on and public involvement. So that's the process we're in. As part of that, I've been appointed by the mayor to be the representative of the city, both me and Chair Birch, and I do so in his absence. Have been appointed by the mayor to attend these meetings and act as the city's representative to basically gather information and then to vote on issues as the committee takes them up and moves them forward. Very much similar to what you're doing here, Planning Commission. There's a county level committee that we sit on. It's called the Plan Growth Committee. So their meeting was this afternoon and both Mayor Hayes and I attended that. The discussion centered mainly around, first, the county did get responses to their RFQ for consultants. So they have 2 consultants that they got 3 responses and they're interviewing 2 of them. So they will likely make a selection and hire a consultant to do the county comprehensive plan update. And that process is going forward and that impacts, we had gotten direction from council and opted into having the county take a little bit of our grant fund that we get and do the inventory work to figure out what we have in our inventory and what's left on the ground and what we may need for what we have for plans for capital facilities and all of those things. So they'll take that and compile that. And it was my recommendation to use the county's consultant to do it because frankly, their cost was cheaper than we could have ever done it for independently. They wanted $2,500 is what they were estimating. It'll be refined a little bit once they get the consultant on board and work out a contract number with them, but to get that inventory piece done, I think that's valuable.
So how many cities participating in that?
Right now, there have been 3 cities that have expressed interest in that pending notification of final number. And then the city of Chehalis has neither expressed an interest nor not because they couldn't get in front of their council in time. So I think it's pretty likely. I'm also the city planner in Chehalis, so I think it's pretty likely that they'll also go along with that, but their council hasn't decided. The other elements of that, we're just kind of going through the mandatory changes that we have to address. And I think county staff did a great job at outlining the different responsibilities at different levels. The county is responsible to do some things, whereas the cities aren't. Some of the larger cities are required to do those things. The smaller cities are not. So we went through a list of those. I can go through those individually, but they're kind of boring to talk about individually. I think the main thing that we get out of there was that climate change and resiliency planning was where they kind of focused the bulk of their time. And that's an important discussion because you live in a community that has potential impacts from the environment that may occur as we saw many years ago. And the idea that you need to now incorporate into your comprehensive plan some resiliency planning for that. As well as the updated environmental regulations for ongoing protection of the environmental elements throughout. So it's twofold. It's resiliency from damages coming from natural disasters, and then also coming from the protecting the environment as you go forward and do development, so that development doesn't harm the environment, and then when the environment harms you, to demonstrate that you have some resiliency plan for that. Interesting idea behind comprehensive plans. That's new. There was a lot of discussion about lowering barriers for both multifamily residential, and the idea that now state legislation basically requires that you have at least 2 additional dwelling units on each residential lot. That you allow that, and that you not have regulations that prohibit that. So as part of this comp plan process, we'll have to see how that fits into our vision and adopt some language in there, and then we'll have to adopt zoning code that reflects the allowance of additional dwelling units, at least 2 per lot.
2 per lot?
+2.
Yeah, so you get the 1 + 2.
There was a fair amount of discussion about whether we should, if you were going to address that, like water hookups and infrastructure that
Right.
serves concerned that you needed a 3x your infrastructure planning, which is a hand grenade.
Yeah, the how you do that for a community that put in water and sewer systems that serve single family residential. But now you're allowed to do 2 more residences on each one of those lots.
Is that 2 full residences or like ADUs?
2 ADUs.
Yeah, they don't want you
Okay.
limiting them in any way. There's.
Huh,
Well, and ADUs are required to be completely self-sufficient.
Hmm.
So.
Is there any limit on size?
No, you develop that in your zoning code. But there's a requirement that you not be any more restrictive on the ADUs than on the existing single family residences.
Tom, can you send the sheet with all of the House bills that were referred to?
I can contribute that to the entire planning commission. Both of the sheets, there's 2 of them, both of them are very informative. But this one, this is the memorandum for comprehensive plan mandatory updates, and this is what they prepared that goes through all the list of things that that have been changes in legislation that require new updates. This isn't a comprehensive list of all the changes we need to make in our comp plan. I think Cindy's probably familiar with those. She just went through the rest of them last year to see what all the requirements were, but these are new changes in the last year or 2 that. So those are the big ones off the list. I'd be happy to email this to all of you and you can take a look at it. Again, when I'm emailing with the planning commission, we don't want to email the entire planning commission back. I'll email all of you, but if each of you ask your questions of me individually or Cindy or anybody else. But if you ask questions of that are broadcast to everybody, and we start a conversation, that becomes a public meeting, and that's not allowed. So I just want to remind everybody of that. If you do receive an email from me that goes to all of you, don't reply to all, reply to me. And then I can address your question, or I can bring it up at our next planning commission meeting, we can have a discussion on it.
So I recommend you just black out the other one.
That would be a very good thing to do.
That's a good idea.
So that way, if you do hit reply all, you only get me. The other document that they provided was. It was more requirements related to the zoning code. That one, I'll just go from memory instead of trying to pull it up here. That one, basically went through, the required updates, but it took it from a little bit different approach. It discussed the, kind of the specific elements and some of the things, that were included in each one of the comprehensive plan pieces. I better pull it up. I'm not gonna do well unless I have something to look at. So, the discussion related around those jurisdictions that want to do urban growth boundary expansions, as the city of Toledo does, because we've consumed most of our urban growth area. So, the discussion was basically from the county level, because what we do is through this process, we'll identify what we want. But the county is actually the authority that allows urban growth boundary expansions. So we'll be basically making our pitch to the county for, here's what we need to grow for the next 20 years. Here's our urban growth area, and here's how, and here's what we'd like to grow. In order to, so the county put together a list of, well, here's what you're required to show us before we are allowed to say this. Because the state has requirements on them, they not expand urban growth areas. The state tries to keep everything contained in small areas. So they don't want you to expand your urban growth areas by default. So you really need to demonstrate that. So what the county staff did is they went through a list of things about, well, here's what we need to see. So we talked about the demonstration of need. You need to show that it's something that's necessary, not just something you want. You need to show that even though you are now housing 3 homes on each lot, that you still need more homes someplace else. Because the state law, remember, requires you to allow the 2 ADUs, which are housing on each one of your lots. And there's a lot of things we talked about for strategies about how to do that. The impacts on transportation, the impacts on urban services, water and sewer and schools and parks and other things too. You need to demonstrate that when you expand your urban growth areas, that you're planning for those things. They also, as part of the new state legislation, is they don't want you to urbanize floodplains. So any areas that contain floodplains or are designated as floodplains, they would rather you don't include those in your urban growth areas. There are some circumstances where you can. They want you to make sure that you considered rezoning all your property to upzone it. As a consideration, they want you to show that you've done your work and say, yes, we thought about doing this, but this doesn't meet our growth needs, so we still need more area. And then to make sure that the city's gone through their public engagement process individually when they expand their urban growth areas. And then also to demonstrate that that's all consistent with county-wide planning policies too. So they have a separate list that you have to go through that shows that your expansion meets those. And under those circumstances, the county will support an urban growth boundary expansion as long as you can demonstrate all of those things. So we'll have to take on that burden when we go through the process. First, we start by doing the analysis and the inventory to figure out what we have. And then we've already got the county to accept our growth numbers, which we all worked on. Mayor and Chair Birch and I all worked on those numbers, and the county did accept those, and they adopted those by the Board of County Council. So, once we have our inventory, we've already got our adopted growth, then we need to do some analysis to figure out what we have in our existing land area, and then what we need to be able to house those people, employ those people, and provide public services for those people. And then we can ask for an urban growth boundary expansion. And hopefully that aligns with what we want to do.
That should prove interesting.
Well, all of you get to be a big part of that process.
What is the deadline to incorporate all those new state requirements?
So that is the 2025 update.
2025.
Right now, we're working methodically through that process. I think it has to be done by June of 2025 because that's when the grant funding expires. The actual updates can proceed beyond that, but there's no state funding beyond that date. And they don't give us enough grant funding to be able to do all the work, so we'll be doing a lot of it here, planning commission.
There wouldn't be restrictions on. Like right now, for example. Water hookups are what? 9,000, 10,000? Ish,
More than that now.
more than that now?
So, 11.5. Correct? 11.5.
Are there like, I mean, we have to require full utilities for the ADUs, so that would,
They have to,
we're not restricted on being able to require that of them, right?
So
they have to be self-sufficient, would they not have to have their own water service and sewer service?
So the state law doesn't say that you have to have their own individual connections. That is a jurisdictional thing that you can choose to do.
Okay.
When I wrote the ADU code in the city of Kalama last year, their public works director insisted that they all have separate water and sewer connections.
And I think we will too.
Is it gonna use up one of your, what, it's gonna use up
One of your-
allotment regardless?
A lot.
So where you're allowed to have a certain number of gallons per day, yes, they'll be using gallons per day and they will.
Well, I don't expect that we're gonna have this spur of building. I can see this turning into an Airbnb situation quite quickly.
You know, the interesting thing in Kalama is there was a lot of public interest about that, but as we were going through the process and I was working through the code with planning commission, there was that. There were people thinking this is gonna happen, this is gonna ruin our city. But that code has been adopted now for 8 months, at least 6, maybe 8 months, and they've had one ADU application.
Well,
I mean, you think that, oh my gosh, you can do this, but when you start to look at the cost of developing an
yeah, you
ADU,
can't.
and especially with the cost of an additional water and sewer connection,
Yeah.
and then the permitting cost, and then the building and construction cost,
There are not a lot of people running around with a couple of $100,000 in there.
right?
Yes,
So the idea that some people are gonna rush out and do these things willy-nilly is just, I mean, it's a valid concern. But I just haven't seen it happen in the jurisdictions I've been involved with, even in Clark County and Vancouver, when they allowed ADUs. You just don't see them dominating the landscape. They just don't, they're not as easy as people think, even once the code's adopted to allow them. And when you develop that code that allows them, you'll be able to put certain restrictions on them too.
One of the things that Centralia was Centralia, right?
Yeah,
Centralia did, and this affects us because we have the duplexes being half again the lot size, right? So if you want to do a duplex in Old Toledo at 6,000 square feet.
right.
They've gone the other direction because they don't really want the ADU. They would rather get rid of the single family dwelling. So they, I guess, leaned into it and opened up and said, if you want to build a triplex, build a triplex. We'd rather have that than, than a house and 2 tiny homes. Or a house and 2 small buildings. And so that kind of, somebody could come in and build 3 houses in our 4,000 square feet, and we can't stop them. So maybe we get rid of the 6,000 square feet and encourage them to just build a duplex if that's what you want.
well, as long as you can get 22,000 square feet, you can build it.
Well, and that as well,
That's-
but.
So you lead way in. I mean, yes, they've done good by eliminating the restriction on a single family residence, and they've said you can build up to a triplex on a single family lot, but on a 22,000 square foot lot, you're not allowed to build a multi-unit apartment building. They have different zones for
They do,
multifamily.
right. But I was just looking at our duplex might become moot. At least that's what Eric Eisenberg.
Yeah, well, that's what Eric was suggesting, is that because you can't, so you can actually, so the discussion today about those and what they tried to do was, because you can't really be overly restrictive on the ADUs. You can restrict their size, and to a certain degree, you can restrict their location, but you're forbidden from putting any restrictions on those that you don't put on single family. So one of the things that you could do is build an ADU that goes up to 35 feet in height. And then basically dominates the lot. It's bigger than the structure that was there. So what they did was they just said, well, we're just gonna allow a triplex on a lot, because that's effectively what we're allowing anyway through the ADU process, right? There's nothing that distinguishes between the primary residence and the ADUs anymore. We can't be any more restrictive. So we're just gonna allow you to do up to 3 units on a lot. And that's the way they leaned in. But I don't agree with, I think you can make them be smaller than the primary residence on a lot. We did that in Kalama. They're limited to a certain square footage and to a certain height.
Do they have to have their own driveway, or is it a common driveway?
You're allowed to require them to have 1 parking space, 1 additional parking space. But you're not allowed to put any additional parking restrictions on ADUs by state law.
Then are reflective of the main house itself.
They have to have, you can require them to have 1 additional parking space to the main house for each.
For ADU or?
Yeah.
So if they want 2 ADUs, they need to provide 2 more parking spots.
Plus whatever you require for your single.
Gonna get really kind of busy in a 4,000 square foot lot.
There's things we need to address to help guide that in the right direction.
Yeah.
You know, one of those is our height limit being 45 feet tall.
Yeah,
I mean, you,
But again,
That would be a
you
fun
look at multiple
commentary.
zones.
at least in the old, yeah, at least in old Toledo, yeah.
You could look at multiple zones and you could zone Old Toledo to be a certain zone with smaller height limits and different things, and then you could allow something more in New Toledo. You know, you could allow things like multifamily. So that's the idea of coming up with different zoning districts.
Yes.
And different standards, but your ADU code would only apply to your residential districts. You have to allow ADUs in any of the single family residential zones. So,
it's worth finding a good balance on the ADUs, because there is. For families that need to take care of other family members, they're a fantastic option.
Well, my son has one for his parents.
Yeah.
And it works out great. And they're autonomous, but they're right there.
Exactly,
You know, so
yeah.
if they need help, they're right there. I think from where we sit now, that's probably gonna be our primary user, is gonna be somebody caring for somebody elderly. Or a son who wants to, you know, they can't get out of the house, but they can get to the ADU. Or something similar to that, but I do foresee more Kurt Reddicks coming in and buying vacant property and developing them to the max, you know, the triplex on each and every lot and,
Mhm.
well, and right now, there's little you can do to stop that because your zoning code is very permissive. You know, it seems like this community did not want to be regulated. They wanted to be able to have some freedom to do what they want to do with their residential lands and commercial lands. And there's nothing wrong with that until you get to a spot where somebody comes in and proposes a development that's allowed by your code that you don't want. Then you wish you had more restrictive zoning, or maybe some do. I don't know if all do.
I'm not sure it's a matter of they wanted the freedom, I just don't think they ever expected or foresaw.
Right.
This type of thing that the state come down and tell you what you can do.
Well, I do say that with a little bit of respect, though. I mean, I've been a strong personal supporter of individual land use rights too. So I mean, even though I'm a planner by trade, I still recognize that when you own property, you feel like you have a right to use it how you like, but. So I don't say that disrespectfully at all, to the way that the code is written. I can see the reasons that I think are behind it, but maybe it is, maybe it's just, they never knew. Right? It really doesn't matter. The fact is, you have a very permissive code. Whether that's because of a lack of understanding of what could happen with that code, or just a strong desire to remain unregulated in a lot of areas, but either way, it is what it is. The result of that is you have a very permissive land use code that it allows you to do a lot of things that you may not want, or that some in your community may not want.
We're gonna need to get to work on that sooner than later.
All of these will be, so what happens is the comp plan is the guiding theoretical element. And that's required to be done by 2025, about June. Once that's done, then we'll begin implementing the comp plan. So in 2025, 26, 27, then we would begin updating our land use codes to try to be reflected. We can do that sooner if we want to. I mean, these are changes in state law that have a mandate now. And should be addressed sooner if you can, but the fact is that those are big budgeting items too. So, you know, when you start to peel apart sections of your land use code and developing new ADU codes, then it's very time consuming, and council planning commissions that meet once a month can only take on so much too. I mean, that's, you know, and the volunteers that support the city can only take on so much. So.
Thank you, Todd.
I'm just,
Great discussion about this stuff.
Yeah, appreciate the knowledge dump. That was very informative, educational.
my mind is reeling right now. Well, I don't have anything else. It's gonna take a lot of thought on our parts and some direction from the council and. I would entertain a motion to adjourn, unless there's public comment. You know, notice I just segued right into that. Anybody want to say anything? Okay, motion to adjourn,
So moved.
second,
Seconded.
all in favor?
Aye.
Told you it was a hanger day.
No.
Yeah. You didn't say. Well, that's, it's a piece, it's not me, but everybody here is the same, you know, everybody comes with a different perspective, so.